Hello and welcome to our final series of our Connect resource as we're going to be working through the book of Ruth. It is great to be together for our final one, and we have saved the best till last.
Wow.
That's a
Debatable.
big statement. But
It's a big statement.
I am joined today by Andrew Gibson, who is our senior pastor, and Jill Boyd, who's one of our elders.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for joining us.
Good to
In
be
the
here.
hot seat, the shaky seat.
I know. I'm
be
not
careful.
going to move just in case I fall.
So, like I said, we're in our last video of our Connect resource. It's been an amazing series. There's quite a bit to unpack today, but just before, as we get going, I'd love to hear what this word hesed has been talked about, or chesed, as I think you got us saying that at one of our services. So, what are you wrestling with? What are you seeing as Jill, we'll start with you. What are you kind of learning as we go through the series?
Well, I've said it already that it's a huge word, so many meanings to it. But I think the heart of it is that it's not just this thing that's known in our head, that it's actually this thing that my iPad's ringing.
Just
Do not
include this in the
disturb.
outtakes.
I'm so sorry.
Jill, you got us saying this word over and over again at one of our services that you preached at, the chesed. Can you say it for me?
Chesed.
Thank you. The hesed, right? God's hesed lived out through us, these different aspects coming out. What for you have you been thinking about, journeying with as we talk about this?
Yeah, like I think I said in one of my preaches that it is a huge word, and there's a whole list of words that it could possibly be in English, and that whole list is amazing. Like even just one of those words, if you meditate on it, it's fascinating to think that that's God's affection and intention to us as his people. But I think the biggest thing that just constantly challenges me is that this isn't just something for me to experience for me, it's for them me to live it out. And I think that's the challenge. I think it was your notes that was like, hesed is not just said.
Yeah.
It is lived. It is meant to find its feet as we become hesed in the world. And I think that makes it not just an epic word, but a real challenging word, because it's moving it from here to our hands.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of flow. I get it. It drops to my heart. I believe it, and then I live it. And I think that's just the incredible thing with faith, isn't it? Is that we don't just know stuff for knowing's sake. We're to become it in the world, and that's how people find the Lord.
Yeah, which is so. I think it was actually you that said this, or somebody said that Ruth is it's so ordinary. It's like ordinary moments after ordinary moment, and it's just in those ordinary moments when we are the hesed of God, you see, and yet this leads to the lineage of Jesus. And we'll talk about that today. But yes, we are becoming the hesed of God, right? Like we are living this out, and we would actually love for you guys to actually think through how do we live this out? Who are the people that we are living this out with, which is so important. What about you? You wrestling with this and seeing that?
Yeah, I think for me that line that God is kinder than we imagine and more loving than we think. I think that is a great sum up of hesed, and a great sum up actually of Ruth as we read it. I think that just whenever you think you get to the end of where God's love goes to, you're like, oh, but then it goes beyond, and it goes beyond. So that's really cool. I just love as well the spread of hesed.
And you nearly stole that, Nutella.
Like, yes, so just to clarify, it was just about things spreading, right? But it's like when we see the hesed from, I would go so far as to say, like when we see the hesed of Ruth and Orpah in accepting and taking on Mahlon and Chilion as husbands, I think there's something that's pretty cool. And then I think then that hesed then moves into how they are with Naomi, how Naomi is with Ruth, how Ruth is with, how Boaz is with Ruth, how Ruth is to Boaz. I think there's just a spreading, and it's almost like this contagious. Once God's hesed is caught, it can do no other but transform and then be evidenced and seen. And so hesed is transformational. So I've been sort of thinking around that.
It's great. Hesed spreads. Unbelievable. this is our final chapter, Ruth. Such a small book, but packed, and hopefully you guys have benefited from this. I know I have loved talking through it with Laura and Carl, and with Alistair and Charlotte. And last time we talked through chapter 3, which is quite a unique chapter. You've got to unpack it quite a bit to understand what's actually going on here, right? You wouldn't prescribe somebody that behaviour, and yet there's so much meaning in it. And we talked a little bit about power and how Boaz uses his power. He doesn't abuse his power, but he actually goes above and beyond. And so it brings us to our final chapter here, where Boaz is now going to seek, he's going to go to the gate, which was a common practice, and it's something called levirate marriage. Or can you give us a little bit of that, Jill? What is that? What was that?
Well, I think it was the idea that when a woman found herself on her own, then there would be this option for her to go and figure out who's her nearest relative, or who's the nearest person who could help me. Because being a woman without a husband, without a father, on your own, is awful, because the males in that society, in a patriarchal society, were your source of protection, your provision, and your name. So these women now find themselves without any of that, and so it's all up for grabs. So typically what would have happened was the woman would have went and then approached the kinsman redeemer. What we actually see that's fascinating here is that Boaz goes for her.
Yeah.
Right, which I think is really interesting, because it lends and leads into just what we're seeing in his character. He's a man of nobility, he's honourable, he's a true gentleman, right? And I think that there's something really beautiful that he does that for her. So he goes to find, I guess, then the nearest kinsman redeemer who could possibly redeem their family and take under his wing, Naomi and Ruth. And he does find someone who actually is closer in lineage to himself. And I think I did say this, but is he being a wee bit sneaky? Because he's going, by the way, Naomi's back, and there's this land, and you're the closest one to her, so you could get the land. Oh, by the way, it comes with a Moabite, right?
Yeah.
And then that's when we see this guy, the other guy, kind of back off.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the other guy's not named, because he then becomes this non-participant in a story that actually maybe God's hand was all over. And so this guy writes himself out of a story, not even named, because he's went, no, I'm all right. You can have the land and the Moabite, which leads into what's going on there. What goes on when he hears the word Moabite. And I think that's what we've been discovering over the last couple of weeks, is just how bad a name to an Israelite a Moabite name would have been.
Yeah, we've unpacked that, I think, a few times of how significant that was. So what we see in chapter 4 is that you mentioned this idea around Ruth not having a name, and Boaz goes and advocates for her, and then as the story goes on, when their marriage is celebrated, or their union is celebrated, the local people don't actually give Ruth a name, right? They call her the woman. And daughter-in-law when they're talking to Naomi. And what has been suggested is that this could be the author highlighting a sense of prejudice still towards Ruth. Despite everything she's done, the character she's shown, now she is one of them, there's still a level of prejudice. I would love, Gibbo, for you to touch on this a little bit. Prejudice, we've talked a lot about it, and this is quite a tough conversation of how do we actually start to identify some of our own prejudices. Can you just start to expand on that a little bit?
I think first of all it would be to admit that they're there. Regardless of how much you think they're not there, or how much you've developed as a person or grown or whatever. I think there's a recognition that that they're there. I think as well it's important not to read scripture as if you're always the hero in the story. So even reading that, there's part of me that goes, oh, those people, they're calling her the woman, and actually, would I have done any different?
Right.
At times in my life, have I had that attitude towards people who are not like me, or who look different to me or think different to me? What is my attitude to those who aren't like me? I suppose that's the that's the challenge. Even like who is in your life. You know, Jill and I were just chatting there about if you're in a group and your friendship group are all the same as you, think like you, read the same books as you, watch the same things as you, just are like you multiplied out.
Looking at like yourself in a mirror, really, isn't it?
That would be
Like,
glorious for me.
wow. Like
Humility.
you're actually, you know, there's a fair chance that you're never going to have any of your opinions challenged or your thoughts challenged or your beliefs, or the angle at which you see something at changed, because the lens that you see something through is the lens that you see something through. So actually to look at that from a different lens, and I think that's what Jesus does so wonderfully. It's just like invites people into a different way of looking at something. So he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, you know, the Samaritan. So again, similar type vibe of what's going on here between the Israelites and the Moabites, you know, the Jews and the Samaritans, and he invites people into this story of where the Samaritan actually shows Hesed, actually shows extravagant kindness. And you can just hear the people of the day go, even that phrase, you know, how can a Samaritan be good? Is there such a thing as a good Samaritan? You know, insert our own, whoever that people group may be. Is there such a thing as a good?
Yeah.
You know, we've seen polarization increase over this last number of years, you know, across Europe and America, in the West, you know, this even all worldwide, these increasing polarizations between this side and that side, right, left, red, blue, Democrat, Republican, nationalist, you know, unionist, all of these divisions, Brexiteer, you know, all of these stuff going on, and actually the ability to see things from a different perspective challenges prejudice.
Yeah. Thank you for that, because it is tough to admit that we have a prejudice. There's it can vary, and in this day and age, it's almost like if you admit prejudice, you are cancelled or you're shamed, or you. So we can flip that way and go. We want a space where people can be real and admit their prejudice. Bring it, even in connect groups, of saying, I'm recognizing that I see this, and that's honourable to.
It's the beginning of transformation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. You said something earlier really good. I just want to draw it here of like, you actually asked Gibbo the question of like, why do we cling to prejudice, right? Like, it's why do we go after that? Like, why does that make us feel somewhat more, I don't know, safer, or there's a sense of belonging? Is there anything you want to say to that?
I think what we were chatting about when I said that was this whole concept of like being around people like us, who think like us. Because I think deep down, we want to belong to somebody, right? We want to belong. We want to say, this is my place, this is my safe place. There's a sense of, I guess, is there a community in it? But yet the ironic part is, in Christian community, is that God is asking us to put a kingdom lens on, right? Where actually everybody's in. Right? Which is the interesting thing. So whilst my flesh has a prejudice, I guess what we're being drawn into in a gospel story is that actually we would start to see what you're saying about perspective. We would see things from a kingdom perspective, that we would put on a kingdom lens and realise that someone can actually be so different from me, look different, be from a different social class, be entirely different in every way, but yet the thing that I see in them is Christ, which is the mystery of the gospel, right? Christ in you, the hope of glory. Christ in me, the hope of glory. So we could be the most different people on the planet, but when I look at you, I see Jesus, and I think that's where we need to be going. But I think that you're right in saying we need to identify our own cultural prejudices first.
We've got to be brave like Boaz. You know, and while I would like, Ruth is the hero of the story in so many regards. But what we learn from Boaz is bravery to see the other, and to act, like to do something about that, you know, and to be countercultural, and to be that one who sees beyond and sees the human being, sees the person.
It's good.
Not just the nationality or the label assigned to that person.
I'm just thinking as you're talking, like I justify my prejudices so often, right? Like, it's because they do this, it's because they do that. Like, to allow the holy, that reflective search me and know me prayer of David to say, come Holy Spirit, just identify for me. It's such a helpful practice, isn't it? Of actually
if there be
inviting.
any wicked way in me.
Yeah. But it takes a level of courage, and I'm glad you guys are drawing that out, because I think it is really important to do that. And what I'm hearing is the marker for how we see others is Christ in them. So anytime we don't see somebody like that, that is maybe not necessarily prejudice, but that's where we want. That's our aim. Yeah. That's our goal, is to see Christ in others, no matter who they are, and no matter where they're from.
It's almost even back, isn't it, to the image of God in people?
It is.
Yeah.
Right? It's right back to the start.
It's the Salam, male and female. He created them in God's image. He created them.
Yeah.
That should be our first thing.
You draw out this last bit of Ruth chapter 4 and verse 18, Gibbo, this genealogy of David. I'd love for you just to unpack that a little bit for us, and then I want us just to digest as we kind of finish off this series. Can you take us there, and then we'll talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I just think it's interesting that because names are important, I think, throughout Ruth. Like, the names are very significant of everybody, and when we see the first name in Ruth, we see that it is Elimelech, which means my God is king. And of course, this is written in a day where there was no king. These are the days of the judges. So that's interesting. Because then the last name that we see in Ruth is the name of David, of course, who would become Israel's king and arguably the most famous and most popular king of Israel. But actually, the significance of that is that from the throne of David and the line of David would come Jesus, the King of Kings. So I think we mustn't lose the significance of that. I think it's interesting that when we see verse 17, and it finishes off actually there, because it says there, the son born to Naomi, his name is called Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. It could stop there, but it doesn't.
Yeah.
It goes on, and then it has this phrase, now this is the genealogy of Perez, and it goes on and goes on. So that particular structure of genealogy is seen 10 times in Genesis, once in Numbers, and I think, and then once here, definitely once in either Numbers or Deuteronomy, and then here. So it's the 12th time that we see this type of genealogy. So again, your alert should be going off with the number 12. There's a significance of that. So there's significance obviously in the tribes of that there are 12. There's a significance in the 12 disciples. There's a significance because 12 times 12 is this like complete unit of God's people, both Old and New Covenant, both Israel and church. And actually, above all of those things, Elimelech's name is my God is King, which is interesting. And I think that's where the author is wanting us to go and be led to in terms of the King of Kings is going to come from this story of what looks like nothing, what looks like widowed, hungry, immigrant, ordinary, painful journey and story, to utter restoration, redemption, transformation, which would, out of this, who these people don't even give the dignity of calling her name, out of that, she's in the genealogy then of Jesus when we go further on, and the King of Kings comes from the time where there was no king. I just think it's amazing.
So
brilliant.
Isn't that so good? Like,
Couldn't make it up.
it's so,
You really couldn't.
let's not go there. But that is like, that's what I mean. Like a tiny book, and yet when you draw
it's
the
massive.
where it goes in
Massive.
Scripture. And I actually loved hearing you speak on this, Jill, where you're piecing together even Bethlehem, House of Bread, Jesus is the bread of life. Like, it's amazing that this can unpack in so many ways. Where I'd love to land then is, as you mentioned, this genealogy, and then so when we go to Matthew 1 and he gives the lineage of Jesus and the genealogy of Jesus, he includes people like Ruth, he includes Rahab. These people that we've just discussed, Ruth was not given her name, she was called daughter-in-law and woman, and yet he includes it in the lineage of Jesus. That has to be on purpose by Matthew. He's including outsiders, so to speak.
Oh yeah, even particularly because of the audience that Matthew was primarily writing for,
Right.
which was not a Gentile audience, it was a
Right.
Jewish audience. Yeah,
So the fact that he includes them in there
Yeah.
Big statement.
teaches us something. And what I'm seeing in this story of Ruth right throughout is the outsider shows the insiders actually the way of Hesed. What like this is stumping me. Like why is God showing us that? What can we as a church take from that, Jill? But what do you think? Like the outsiders showing the insiders the way. What can we take from that as we try and unpack that?
Like, I even think it's an interesting discussion for even us to go, who's in, who's out, right? Because I think with the whole narrative, like right the way through from Genesis, is like who we think is in and the way we think God should work is not what He does, right? Which tells me actually human beings are really terrible at making the who's in and who's out. They can't judge that because this is such an inclusive story where God's going, no, it's all.
Yeah.
Don't you get this?
Yeah.
Don't you get this?
And I can, in so many ways, it's for, and we quote this all the time. Though, for God so loved the world, or God loved the world in this way. He loved the world, like He loved the world. Like that's the world. That's everything, and so, and it says, Jesus is making all things new. There's this heart of inclusivity. There's this heart of wholeness. There's this heart for a huge thing. That's why Jesus says, don't judge. It's like when He tells parables, it's not you to sort out who's here. Because as humans, we love sorting out, and I think we love sorting who's in and who's out.
Because we want to be in.
Because we want to be in, and then we can actually create these boundaries and say, well, unless you are inside this boundary, then you're not in.
Which is then prejudice again, right? Comes back into that.
Which is then prejudice. But this genealogy is an expansive, broad, mind-blowing in Matthew. And it builds on that story or that genealogy of Perez, Jill, so it's maybe even useful, like you mentioned about the story of Perez there, which I don't think we want to leave out.
No.
Is that okay?
No, go for that.
Yeah, because I think, is it in Ruth 4 verse 12, the people say, may your house become like the house of Perez, the son that Tamar bore to Judah.
Yeah.
And there's some commentaries that allude that that's a wee bit of a sting comment. They're trying to like rattle Boaz a little bit, because actually the story of even Perez being born, like that's an incredible story. That's a story of injustice. That's a story of Judah from the 12 tribes promising this girl that you'll get my next son, you'll get my next son, you'll get my next, right? This whole thing. And he cheats her. And then she has to disguise herself as a lady of the night, right? A prostitute, to then get Judah to sleep with her, which is where Perez is born. So there's something about deception and manipulation that is going on with Perez and the birth of Perez. And so there's people that have thought, are they alluding to this whole story as something similar? That actually Ruth bearing this child to Boaz, is there something else going on? Is there a wee bit of, backhandedness? Or I don't know. I think if you read all around that, you could come up with lots of things, but it's in there.
But I have heard this says, and let's finish on this, because I think this is really important. I've heard it often said, like, despite who they were, God shows His grace, right? Or despite who Rahab was, God shows us He loves us. I don't love that, because I think if it wasn't for Rahab, if it wasn't for people like Ruth, it's not despite who they were. It's like, no, because of who they were, the lineage of Jesus has been allowed to prosper. Because of who they are, I show you the way of Hesed. The outsider shows the insider the way to go. Can you land the plane a little bit on that? Like that is radical.
Yeah, it is. And I think talk of landing the plane, I don't think you can go much beyond what Jesus says whenever he sits his disciples down and there's other people gathered around, and he sits in the Sermon on the Mount and he says, blessed are the poor in spirit.
Yeah.
And as we read through the Beatitudes, everyone who we think or who's assumed to be the ones who are getting it all, actually Jesus challenges us, to reconsider and to see things as He sees things, and to not be a somebody who wants to rule others out, but who is looking for ways of bringing people in, no matter who they are. And the other story, which is from Genesis to Revelation, of redemption and of restoration, and of the one who makes all things new and works all things together for the good. So yeah, where do you want to land it? I mean,
No, that's great.
blessed are the poor in spirit.
And mature, like, thank you, Gibbo. So that is, I think that is landing the plane. And Jill, like, how do you finish this as we end this series? What something to take away as we see this off?
I think even as we're talking about the genealogy and then bringing it through to Jesus, right? This David, and then from the line of King David will come the King of Kings. I think what's really cool. So obviously Hesed is a Hebrew word. And when we jump into New Testament, it's Greek. So we kind of drop the word Hesed. But the closest phrase, which is so cool that we have to it in the New Testament, is the phrase grace and truth, which I don't know what it is in the Greek, so please forgive me, but I don't know, you should maybe know, but it's like this grace and truth, right? But interestingly then, when you think of John 1, the word becoming flesh, in verse 14, it's like, and here's Jesus, full of grace and truth. So we're saying here is Jesus, full of Hesed, right? And I just kind of go, what a way to land that, right? That in the end of this whole thing about this story of Ruth, the Hesed of God in action, actually from her line lands Jesus, the full embodiment of Hesed, the one who we follow, the one who we are becoming like. We've already said Christ in us. Right, the rest of our journey is about how do we get that out in our flesh? How do we live this out so that the world can see it? So Jesus, full of grace and truth. Keep
Brilliant,
going.
like, and it is amazing how that brings full circle then. As we were pursuing Hesed, we are just following Jesus. We're apprenticing to him and going for him. So hopefully that is really beneficial for you guys as you unpack this in your Connect groups. Thank you both for joining us. And what an amazing series. And we're excited to hear stories of how you guys continue to live this out and wrestle with this and all of the things that we've talked about today as well as the other weeks. If you'd love to know more about how CFC is getting involved and serving different organisations, partnering with organisations, check out thisiscfc.com/missions. And that can just maybe be a way that you as a Connect group could serve or get involved more. But thank you for checking this out, and hopefully you have a great conversation in your Connect group.